to a Hope 1032 podcast.
Hello everyone, it's so good to be back with you. Welcome to Season 6 of Raising Teens. I'm your host, Collett Smart. I'm a psychologist, a teacher, and also a parent in the middle of raising my own teen and young adult children. I started this podcast because I know that many teens are struggling, and I wanted to create an online village of support for parents. I'm joined again this season by well-known experts on teen mental health and well-being. I have such hope for this generation of young people, so each episode is jam-packed with support so that you can get on with the job that you do best. That is, connecting with and loving your teen. Andrew has been described as an interesting mixture of Billy Connolly, Tim Winton, and Fraser Crane, and as someone who puts the heart back into psychology. As a clinical psychologist, Andrew Fuller works with many schools and communities in Australia and internationally, specialising in the well-being of young people and their families. He is a fellow of the Department of Psychiatry and the Department of Learning and Educational Development at the University of Melbourne. He's the author of Tricky Kids, Guerrilla Tactics for Teachers, and a number of other books. Andrew has also co-authored a series of programs for the promotion of resilience and emotional intelligence used in over 3,500 schools in Britain and Australia called the Heart Masters. Andrew continues to counsel young people and conduct workshops for organisations, parents, students, teachers, and health professionals on a wide range of topics. Hello, Andrew. Thank you so much for joining us on Raising Teens.
Oh, it's a delight to be with you, Collett. Thank you so much for having me on.
It's such an honour. You wrote the foreword for my book, They'll Be Okay, which I am always delighted to say. You were the first psychologist that I ever heard speak when I came to Australia almost 20 years ago. It was actually in a school, you won't know this, it was in a school down Blacktown area in, kind of the Sydney surrounds. And I just remember being blown away by how I'd never seen anyone speak the way you speak, if I'm honest. And it was so practical, and you had us around the room doing stuff in a circle and spoke a lot about the teenagers that you worked with. And that was my very first introduction. I don't think I even came up and said hello. I think there were just hundreds of people who were chatting to you afterwards. And then slowly over the years, we kind of crossed paths and then, ended up speaking at some of the same events, and you ended up writing in my book. So, just so good to have you on this podcast today. I wanted to talk a little bit about how the teen years are both wonderful and overwhelming. And I think that's for teenagers and their parents. But some teens tend to just sail through adolescence, and then you get others who struggle with their mental health or their friendships or various issues. And a parent might have 3 children in the same home, seemingly brought up very similarly, yet one teen challenges every single thing that the parent knew about parenting, every boundary, every request. I actually want to start by reading part of your introduction, Born to be Wild, in your book, Tricky Behaviours. It says, stubborn, pig-headed, defiant, oppositional, free-ranging, having a mind of their own, iron-willed, forceful, determined, hard-headed, free-spirited, or just plain difficult. Call them what you will. There are some kids who are incredibly difficult to raise well. And I can just imagine some parents going, I'm so glad someone said those words and wrote those words, because that's me and my situation. So you call these tricky behaviours. I'd love you just to talk us through why parents might find this time so challenging.
Well, I think everybody finds it challenging. I think people, if they're honest, when they reflect back on their own teenage years, they found that difficult as well. But let's focus on parents for the time being. Parenting teenagers is a lot like running a baseball or softball game, really. So basically, one kid comes along and claims a base. And they basically say, well, I'm the kid who's basically the responsible one or the musical one or whatever it is. And a second kid comes along and goes, well, okay, you've got that base covered, so I need to pick a different base. So I'll pick the kind of troublemaker base or the comic base or the kind of dramatist base. And so then typically, let's say with your scenario of 3 kids, then the third kid comes along and goes, okay, you two have got that covered. So I'm going to be the younger, so I'll be cute and I'll just lie around and I'll get people to do things for me. And so you've got these different roles that basically kids have done because they want to differentiate themselves because they want love and attention, right? And so that's their great strategy of doing it. And then just when a parent thinks they've got it all figured out, somebody goes on a sleepover or something happens and everybody changes bases temporarily. And so it's a very complicated business, this parenting of teenagers. There's no simple answers. In fact, anyone that tells you there's a simple answer is just sheer lying through their teeth, let's face it.
Absolutely true. I often say to parents, these children with tricky behaviors, they're going to be the world changers. In the meantime, they're just trying to change their parents. So we're kind of the training ground.
Well, that's right. And that's why I was so honoured to write the foreword to your book. And thank you for that, because, of course, that's right. They will be okay. And we have to help the parents to realise that because they feel like they've done an abysmal job and they haven't. And there's a whole industry in telling parents that they've done badly and that some wise person has the answer for them. And maybe, Collett, you've got the answer, but I know I don't.
No, I certainly don't. And so what then do you say to a parent who might be listening and, again, to use some of the words from your book, they say things like, it doesn't matter what I say, or some days I just feel like screaming at them, or she's fine when she gets her own way, or he can argue for hours, and they just push all the boundaries. What do you say to parents with that?
Well, I think you've got to do 2 things which sound contradictory. The first part is to realise the legitimacy of parents' concerns, obviously. So these kids can be held to live with, there's no doubt, And so having some strategies to really help them makes a big, big difference.
I think by now I'm always positive about raising teens. But that's not to say that there are some periods in parenting our teens that can be really challenging. For some families, this may last for a few months, and their teens seem to almost have changed personalities. For others, this may last a number of years. I've worked with parents who come in to me because they are honestly at their wits' end. They feel as though they're interacting with all of their children in similar ways, but one teen seems to push every boundary. I want you to know that this can be a very normal part of some teens' journey, and you are not a bad parent.
So you've got to work out what's going to make a difference. But on the other hand, these tricky teens have great strengths. So the one that can argue all day is just a born negotiator. Yeah. And so they have some fantastic capacities. So it's trying to do 2 things simultaneously, which, we need to be able to do. One is to try to work out what the parent can do differently, but at the same time, not using it to denigrate or lessen the capacities or learning strengths of the young person.
Yeah. And I think it's that line, or that fine line, I think you juggle it all the time, between understanding that there may be times when there needs to be a consequence or an appropriate boundary, but also not wanting to squash your child, really squash everything, those strengths that you talk about, because when we're trying to squash those behaviors, we can actually eliminate some of those strengths that come along with them. And so I'm not pretending there's an easy answer in how we celebrate and find those strengths, but then still try to parent those children and allow for consequences and boundaries. Do you ever give parents advice for how to find when to do that?
Well, I think the first thing is that we live in a neurodiverse world.
Yeah.
And the more that the latest research on neuroscience shows us is that brains are substantially different. And so the idea that your children will have different brains and deal with and process information and experiences in completely different ways is important to understand.
Yeah.
And so at the same time as we can appreciate differences, we need to hold to the truth that young people develop most powerfully positively when in a family they do pretty much what the big guy or the big girl says. So when the parents are in charge is when kids thrive. So families are not democracies.
Yeah.
Families are benevolent dictatorships. So really what you've got to do is set the pitch for the family, because someone's got to have a culture that basically is positive in this family. And teenagers aren't going to set that. Teenagers will get away with what they want to get away with. They'll always argue about that. So if a parent's not in charge, kids are in trouble.
Yeah.
So this isn't just a kind of soft-hearted, flimsy kind of anything goes parenting. It's saying, no, you've got your strengths, but here in our family, we treat one another well. Or we don't use violence to get what we want. We actually use our words. It's being very clear. So it's not soft parenting, but it's parenting with a strong intention.
So in your book, you describe tricky behaviours or tricky behaviour traits that teens might display. You've actually got some characters that I just think are fantastic. I have to say I kind of recognise the competitor and the debater. Talk us through some of those characters that you've already alluded to, the fact that everyone has their base that they need to stand on or claim. And so some of these traits might come out in some of our tricky teens. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the first thing to recognise is that tricky teens are really clever kids. So it's not that they are troubled, but they have a limited repertoire. And so our job's not to basically squash their main game. Our job is to broaden out their repertoire. So kids will often find a particular strategy and they'll use it over and over and over and over and over again, much to parents and teachers' despair. And so you have some kids who basically always play good. They're the manipulators, and they basically think, okay, I'll just smooth up to you and I'll kind of pretend everything's fine, and anything that was nasty was somebody else's business. I didn't start that. It wasn't me. I didn't do that. And they're usually very verbally acute kids who probably are wonderful in terms of, basically getting away with stuff. And they're kids that can look a lot more competent than they truly are. And so there's a tendency for parents to go, well, they're fine, they've got it together. And then finally they get caught out doing something fairly outrageous, either bullying somebody or lying outrageously and getting caught for it. And the parent kind of has to go, oh no, I think I've loosened sort of the parenting controls too soon. I need to regain that relationship. And so when I talk about parenting manipulators, they've got to have a sense that you've got eyes at the back of your head, that they can't get away with a damn thing, really, because they need that kind of level of surveillance to straighten themselves out. They're great people, but they've kind of been allowed to get away with too much. And we can go on with different types of these kids, but they're just so fascinating. And I would watch for years as parents would drag these kids into my therapy room looking exhausted and looking like they felt as if they'd failed because, of course, they'd been given rotten advice by other parents often, of other mental health professionals often as well, and they wanted to urge them towards some diagnostic category. And it just wasn't warranted. In fact, the diagnostic categories that were thrown at these kids were often not useful at all.
There can certainly be times that we see overdiagnosis, or, as Andrew said, having a diagnosis thrown at a child because no one knows what else to do. Andrew's not saying here that we should never provide a diagnosis. Rather, with some tricky kids, there may be other strategies to use, like looking at their individual strengths. There are times when a diagnosis for some teens and adults can be helpful when behaviors or expressions of emotions affect a teen in negative ways. A diagnosis doesn't mean we're just trying to find an excuse to medicate teens. What I've found is that many families can find a diagnosis helpful when it opens up a whole lot of understanding and then strategies and options for their teen to gain support. There are, for example, lots of support strategies recommended in schools and at home for neurodivergent young people. But it's important to recognize that tricky behaviors can also be an indication that something else is going on for a teen.
And so that's why I came up with this sort of concept of tricky behaviors, because I think it's a much more just way of seeing them and seeing the strengths that they have, and they have enormous strengths. And so the world beaters of history have been tricky teens. There's no doubt in my mind. If you look back at Alexander the Great or Joan of Arc or whoever you want to think of, they weren't easy to parent, you know.
I love that, because you actually start your book with a letter to your teen. And I have to say, Andrew, I feel like almost sometimes it's almost not popular what you've said, but it's so important to say to your teen, this is not a hotel. I'm not the person who comes and serves you in the hotel and brings you food and does your bed and does what you say. And I'm not your best friend either. I think that is so important. And I think that's what I love about your work is your celebration of teens as individuals and the neurodiversity, the celebration of their strengths, but then also calling out that someone needs to be in charge at home. And that is actually what helps young people thrive and what helps them feel safe. And so I really appreciate that in your work.
Thank you. Teenagers, children do not learn how to have good lives and good mental health by having parents who basically are suffering, who are basically under stress all the time. And so you've got to set up a family that works for everybody, and that includes the parents. So it's not about being just let's just basically cave into the kids all the time. It's saying we need to work out a system that works here, because in a family, everybody grows up. And so we all grow up, and partly we grow up through the conflicts that we tackle and negotiate our way through. And so, you know, most families sort of descend down to two debating teams, really. There's one team that want to change things, and that's called the kids. They want to go out more, they want more freedom, they want more pocket money, they want to stay out on a school night. And the other team want things to stay the same. No, it's a school night, you need to complete your study, you need to get this done, you know, all that kind of stuff. And so it's the way a family has that debate between change and not change is the way that we all grow up. So if you don't have that debate, or it's too scary to have it, or if one side always wins, nobody's growing. So it's not about necessarily the parent always winning, but it's the process of how you go through that discussion in a reasonably civilized way that protects everybody.
Yeah. And in some ways, the negotiation or the things will change depending on age and responsibility and so on. So if you have a parent who's saying, I understand that and I get that, and my home isn't a hotel and I'm trying to put in boundaries, but my child just says no matter what I try. What advice do you give parents in those situations?
Well, we're not going to base the whole culture of a family on whether the teenager agrees with it. So one of the things that's important to discuss then is what sort of family life do you want to have? And how do we start to create that by hook or by crook, really? So yes, your teenager might dispute you and go on, but you need to live the way you want to live your life. Now, I, as an outsider to a family, can make some suggestions about, that we want to connect, protect and respect one another or something along those lines. But, I think parents are very wise people. So I don't think that, I think they know when the family works best. And so if we can start to think about that, It's important because otherwise we sort of exclude parents from the process and treat them as if they're sometimes a bit dim-witted. And they're not, they've got they've worked hard to basically create this family. So I don't want to diminish their efforts. I want to enhance their ability to live a great life. I mean, they love their kids. It's not like they're, malevolent or anything like that. They want their kids to have a great life. So I don't have an issue with that. It's how to do it. But if you cave into a kid every time, or are too scared to say, no, we're not doing that, Collett, we're doing this instead, then you end up bitter and you end up frustrated. And that basically becomes contagious. And then what happens in a family is people only look out for what's in it for them. So the whole family becomes transactional. Well, I'm not taking out the rubbish bins unless you pay me $5. I'm not going to walk the dog unless, and everything's got a price tag. And that's not the way to run a family.
Yeah, those are really good points. And so let's go back to your strengths. If a parent's listening to this and they say, you talk about looking for my child's strengths, what do you mean by that? How do I go about that? What does that look like?
Well, some of the strengths are already on show in the way that they create problems. Sadly, yes. It's just sometimes looking at them as a bit of a gift rather than just a pain in the rear end, which can take a bit of a mindset shift. But the other type of shifts is learning strengths. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we all have different brains, and so we process information substantially differently. So to that end, I set up a website called mylearningstrengths.com. And if you go on that website, you can look at a great photo of me because I put a lot of filtering on that photo. And you can do an analysis of your learning strengths. You can do this with your child or for them. And you'll get a free email from me that says, congratulations, Collett, you're good at this and this. Why don't you bet another area? Here's a way of doing it. And the reason I did that was because I thought very few people get to hear from an adult who's neither their teacher nor their parent about something they're good at. Mm. And so that's a starting point. Now, you might do this on behalf of your teenager and you might find they've got great, language and words and people smarts or something like that. And you might proudly take this to your teenager and say, I've just done this thing and this is what it says. And they might go, well, what a load of rubbish. And you go, okay, maybe that's right. But what do you think are your strengths? And so you use it then as a discussion point. Fantastic. Because we really want in our lives to go on a treasure hunt for the best.
Yes.
In our own lives, we want to do that, but we want to do that with our kids as well and teach them how to leverage what they've got going for them.
Yeah.
So part of success in life is finding out being what we call metacognitively knowledgeable, knowing how you learn best. And once you know that, then you can kind of steer yourself towards groups who appreciate what you've got on offer.
Yeah.
And that leads to early success, which is contagious. And it also teaches you to stay away from groups that don't value what you have to offer, which in my case are plenty of them. Yes. You've got to kind of work out where you fit a bit without restricting yourself too much. It's an important skill.
And those are fantastic discussions then to have with your teens. I love that when you focus on their strengths and then say, who do you hang out with or what activities do you do then that play to those strengths? And are there things that are maybe draining those strengths and not letting them come out? And so,
see, one of the things that does drain it is a belief that you should be good at everything. And none of us are.
Absolutely. That saying that tell your child they can be anything they want to be does my head in, Andrew, because they can't. Nobody can be anything they want to be, unfortunately, but that's the truth.
That's right. You've got to work out what you've got going and utilise that.
Yes. And so what are your thoughts on how teachers or principals could work with teens with tricky behaviours? So we always see detentions and suspensions dished out. And, of course, we've already spoken about how some boundaries and consequences for poor choices are necessary in some circumstances. But what can schools do, school teachers and principals do to connect with some of those teens in more positive ways?
The first thing I think that's important to recognise is that punishment does not change behaviour. Let me repeat that. Punishment does not change behaviour. It'll make people more resentful, it'll make them sneakier, but it doesn't change behaviour. What changes behaviour is relationships. And so the strength of relationships in a school and in a family are the most powerful predictor of lifelong success for any young person. And so having somebody who really values you, who knows that you're smart, knows you can get even smarter, and that's a really important point for schools, because schools often are a bit shy of telling kids they're smart, even though they are. We know the research tells us this is the smartest generation of kids ever on the planet. And we've got schools that are saying, I can't tell my kids they're smart. And that's a bit silly, in my view, as an outsider to education. And that's true for girls, but particularly true for boys, because some boys are the masters of minimalism and the practitioners of just-in-time management. So they want to sort of appear to do it effortlessly, right? I just showed up being brilliant, right? That's what a boy wants to do, you know. And if you say, well, I'm not going to talk about how smart you are, I'm going to discuss the effort, that's the last thing a boy wants to hear, that you tried hard. You want to be a try-hard? Forget it. I don't want to be a try-hard. I want to be seamlessly, absolutely, effortlessly brilliant.
We can often think of tricky teens as being those who are the lazy dropout kids. But I think schools and parents should be aware that tricky behaviours can also show up in some of our teens who are high achievers or those significantly pushed academically. Both schools and parents need to be aware of not dismissing teens who appear lazy, but also not pushing kids so much that they burn out. Of course, we want our kids to show up and use the opportunities they're given, but school is not just about learning the curriculum, is it? It's about exploring areas that you're good at. It's about learning social and emotional skills and also developing a work ethic even if we don't enjoy the material. It's about finding a balance between working hard, learning responsibility, and having some fun in their lives. When encouraging our teens' strengths, we can sometimes worry about them thinking, oh, I don't need to work on this anymore. So I asked Andrew his thoughts on this.
There is so much research really coming from Bandura onwards on self-efficacy. So Collett's appraisal of how capable she is at riding a bike will directly relate to her performance on riding a bike. Yeah. So if I can tell her she's going to be great at this, she's going to be fantastic, she's really smart, she can do this, guess what happens? Her performance improves. Guess what then happens? Success becomes contagious. Yep. So that self-efficacy research is incredibly important for us all, I think, but particularly for schools who somehow have got a bit reluctant around this issue.
That's so true, because I think my first degree was in teaching, and I think probably one of the early classes that I ever attended on teaching was on some of that research around, where they put kids in a class with teachers who were told that the children were brilliant, and so they treated them as brilliant children. And then the other class, they were told, oh, they're not so brilliant, and so they treated them as less brilliant. And so then the results were quite different in the children. I think we'd have ethics problems now around those types of research, but the children who were treated brilliantly because the teachers thought they were, they performed well, and the other kids kind of didn't perform very well. And we actually, I think, sometimes forget in schools that the way we treat children can actually make a difference in the outcomes in terms of even their mental health and their education outcomes and so on. So that's such a good reminder.
There's that famous story of a new teacher who was allocated the worst class in the school. And she went on her first day and opened up the drawer of her desk and found a list of all the students and a number next to it, 101, 105, 120, and so on. And the class just basically changed. And the principal came down and said, what are you doing with these kids? They're actually being wonderful for you. And she said, thank you for giving me the smartest class in the school. They're incredible. I've got this list of all of their IQs. And the principal said, that's their locker numbers.
Oh, my goodness. I think I've heard that story, but I hadn't heard the locker number bit. That's hilarious.
So, yeah, people live up to our expectations of them.
Yes, yeah. So, Andrew, what is your hope for teens in your work?
We know so much more now than we did even 2 or 3 years ago about how brains learn, how they succeed. And so the merging of well-being and learning and parenting is an incredibly exciting area. So we know about, we know about neurochemistry a lot more than we used to. We know about mitochondrial mental health. We know so much that is emerging at the moment, which will make such a vast difference. You know, there's so many teenagers out there playing dumb, playing safe, because they're scared. And they're scared because adults are a bit reluctant to believe in them. But the fastest way in a family for a kid to basically succeed is obviously for their parents to convey a message of that they love them, they believe in them, and that they know they are capable. In a school, it's basically a message of we care for you and we like you and we know you're smart and we're going to help you get even smarter.
Andrew reminded me again that high expectations of our teens are so important because despite what we hear about smartphones dumbing them down, they're in fact the smartest and most educated generation. But they need to hear that they are loved by us, no matter how they score on a test. You can also find me or leave a question for a future episode via email or my Facebook page or via raisingteens.au. Or you can go to the Hope 1032 podcast page. Please subscribe and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'd love to see you next episode. And in the meantime, keep parenting with your teen's future adult in mind.
This episode was hosted by Collett Smart, edited and produced by Alec Green, imaging by Lucy Weil, and social media by Beth Rivers.
Hope 1032. Thanks for listening.